Planet of the Apes has swung into theaters, so there's no time to monkey around as we rank all 10 Planet of the Apes movies from our least favorite to our favorite. Hey everyone, welcome to Cinema, where we focus on a film. I'm Josh, this is Simply Cinema. Let me know down in the comments below how you would rank the Planet of the Apes movies from your least favorite to your favorite, whether you only seen the modern quadrilogy or just all 10 of them as a whole. Make sure to like this video, subscribe if you're ready to join this film culture community where we talk about the love of cinema as a whole. But going right into it, in last place we have Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes, one that isn't particularly bad by the setup and everything it has to do going into as a reboot, but one that particularly doesn't connect with me in any sort of way by Mark Wahlberg being too familiar as an actor, as an action star, and doesn't really take me into the environment. The aesthetics when you're getting the early CGI isn't too pleasing for how you're setting up all the costumes that are at play here with the apes. The storyline sort of seems to go into an interesting new direction while also being a little bit close to what the original has to offer, to where you don't get the great divide between what's new, what's old, and what I particularly have loved about the franchises, both the old and the new, that doesn't always have the great vibe, that goes about a weird path, that introduces its own way of telling the story that I do appreciate for what it's trying to go for, but one that doesn't necessarily connect with me in all the right ways. And coming in at number 9, we have Battle of the Planet Apes, one that was the most promising for me as a whole going into this for the first time, but fails to meet all expectations as I've learned the budget was lowering time and time again for every new sequel that we got within the 70s that unfortunately paid the cost of what you're actually ending up with. The final product loses some of the good aesthetics to the nature of most of the costumes, some of them being reused, but some of the apes costumes just not looking so good if they're not reused. And so just what you get out of all of that gets collaborated with all of these different antics, and the ideas themselves seem to be going about so many different directions, while the ones that do work the best is just less compelling and working into the battles themselves, both with the apes and the apes versus humans, just goes in something that is very downscaled to the potential of what you were building up to within all of the movies prior. And while it does provide some good nods toward the previous films that were setting up into what we're leading into this being the final of the films that will eventually lead back into circular motion to the Planet of the Apes movie, ultimately it fails to meet the expectations that really is asking for from the very premise of the Battle of the Planet of the Apes title, and so unfortunately it really gets a drawn back scale to what the film has to offer. And coming in at number 8, we have Beneath the Planet of the Apes. Leading up from the original, we get something that's very underscaled, one that I still enjoy the general aspect to what we get from Charlton Heston and everything that is leading up from the original, but once we get the original and what it leads up to in the beginning of the film, it underwhelms the setup that we got in the very ending of the original Planet of Apes, while going and undermining the huge twist that we got. And there's certain aspects that go about the story that is very strange, what you get for this human environment that is built up and these different gods and everything that wraps up things a bit too soon. And while I get the general premise of what you're getting once you're getting the Attack of the Apes and the ending based on how the gorillas end the earth in the war for different environments, it ultimately plays off its ideas in interesting ways, and one that ends with a shock, but ultimately fails to really develop its ideas in a compelling way by creating new characters that are less interesting and just on a baseline to end the story in a sort of weird environment based on the characters as a whole that becomes less interesting to pay attention to, even if some of the ideas that play off of what we get in the first film just doesn't all line up in all the right ways. Which goes into number 7, we have Escape the Planet of the Apes, one that is interesting by the initial vibe that you didn't know how it would lead off from the second film, and is still good, and the cold opening is just a fun nod to how you're setting up the film, providing that answer right off the bat, and getting the monkeys put onto Earth with just a couple of them pulls a reversal of what we get within Charlton Heston in the first film, and goes about an interesting way that isn't too compelling just because it's bringing us down to a familiar place such as Earth when it was Earth in its fully populated state. And so you're familiar with the setting. It doesn't get too colorful in the nature of how it uses it. There's some brutality that is unexpected of where you're going with this film, leaving you on a big, heavy note to be had with where it really takes something that's sort of a twist of what you wouldn't have expected to have generally gone about with this film, ending on this film with a good note, but ultimately paying off with some aspects to the good characters where you can really enjoy the nature of the apes and how they immerse themselves with fish out of water sort of comedy within this earthly world when it was thriving and well. But ultimately, this film doesn't pay off like some of the latter films are. And coming to number 6, we have Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. Now, this is an interesting exploration just with what you get from this one ape and exploring the world as a whole, from being the one that survived and getting into this highly populated area, and just when this is the aspects where the humans are putting the apes into slavery because they're seeing the smarts out of them. And so it's the reversal again once we get from that, and it answers some of the questions, shows some nods to the future of what we get in the prophecies from Beneath the Planet of Apes, and how that all pulls off is something fun and interesting, but the general nature of what you're getting out of all of these characters and the leader as a whole of Caesar is good enough for what you're asking for. The film becomes compelling by the nature of how you're establishing all these worlds, and hateable villain that is good for what you're asking for it, and compelling to be had as the nature as what you're getting from him. And so the way they all pan out, leading into a strong, heavy battle where it had to be even cut into its own extended cut because of the nature of not wanting to be too brutal, go and lean toward that rated R, becomes interesting as a film history note. But as someone that only watched the theatrical cut, it's still good on its own 2 feet, and it has the immense battles and immense tension that really builds up something I wasn't expecting out of something for getting into the Conquest of the Planet of Apes, that builds up to the heights of Battle of the Planet of Apes that unfortunately underwhelmed. But within this film, it still stands well on its own way of telling its story. And going into the top 5, we have Rise of the Planet of the Apes, the first of the new trilogy, and what we get from it is a good new setup, an interesting aspect where it answers questions that turn some contrivances and things about the way that contradicts what we got in the original, but as its own reboot for its own retrospect, you can enjoy the aspects that you get. The motion picture capture is so good for what we get, and it only gets better within the latter films, but as a whole of this one, you enjoy the nature of Caesar growing up, the different environment that creates a dark tale for what you're getting for the scientific experiments, experimenting on the apes as they try and find a way to get them smarter. James Franco is great as a scientist, as the connection for Caesar, and what you get as a flow from that is a good setup that we get for Caesar. Andy Serkis is good as Caesar, of course, but we get less of him. That takes this film back just a little bit, just from the nature of knowing what we get flowing from that. But the uprising and how you see the buildup of Caesar's character, his learning to speak, his uprising, and being able to gather these apes together as he sees the betrayal of humans while also loving humans because of what we get from his connection with James Franco's character and the scientists as a whole, and just how you flow that out, build up this character that's an ape and make him compelling, make him lovable, while also building the connection between these apes that love and hate villains from the human world, of the natural environment that you set these characters into, becomes compelling by the nature of how they establish everything by the film and how it sets everything up. And coming in number 4, we have Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. Now this is good just by the general nature of how it sets up the world and putting us to a new trilogy, setting up things that we knew happened in the past, but also leading up to what the consequences of the future, with so many new possibilities that this trilogy and franchise could go as a whole, and becoming good by the nature of how it sets Noah as a good character, going into this naive nature, not knowing his past and the past of what we get from the apes, the history of Caesar, and ultimately the tides of secrecy that can be told from Caesar's reign, how the test of time can get twisted, information getting passed down in different ways, and how that sets up a villain that's Proximus Caesar that is good by the nature of how you're caring for all that he's doing, where he is right for everything that he said, but just in a twisted manner of what he knows about Caesar's past and the history as a whole, how it progressed, and even generations past the original trilogy. What you get from the nature of this film becomes compelling as a whole by how they set up all these characters, the contrivances that lead things into a good note that makes sense for the story going forward, setting up something that Wes Ball as the director had a great handle on pulling this film off as a whole. And before we go into my top 3, make sure you like this video if you have been enjoying it thus far. Subscribe if you're ready to join in the film culture community. Make sure to comment down below your ranking of all 10 or just of what you've seen of the Planet of Apes films thus far. And going into my top 3, we have Planet of the Apes. The Charlton Heston is so good as a human that is a primary character, and right off the bat you get set in this mysterious world where you don't have all the answers, and while there's certain aspects of the story that have aged a little bit poorly just by the general vibe of the story, it is good by the world building that you set up within this aspect of the world, creating a mystery and the planet around it having a character of its own, and just what you get from the apes, the establishment and building up of it was always a good feeling vibe that you get from this 60s film that builds up its own stakes, its own world, with all these characters that either love humans, hate villains, humans, and just how they establish that becomes good by the questions that you all have. How did we get into this world as it is today? How did we get all that? And without having provided the initial answers from the very get-go, it leads up into so many questions that still resolves itself just being good by the sci-fi aspect as a whole, and being a sci-fi fan myself is just so pleasing to enjoy for the natural history of this being the first film that launched the first ever sci-fi franchise. And so just by the general aesthetic, I am not underwhelmed by what it has to offer having watched this for the first time. And going to number 2, we have Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. The sequel to what we got recently is just so good by the nature of how it sets up Caesar's character. Andy Serkis, like I said, is good. The stop motion and everything that is pulled off by the motion picture capture is so aesthetically pleasing by the nature of all the characters and movements you get from these apes looking so real in some extent, and getting that nature of the monkeys and the nature of the humans, and seeing the distinct differences as well as similarities based on their behavior and the general act of war that some apes or some humans have against each other by the evilness that we can spread, as well as the good nature of trying to connect with one another, and how you see that progress, how you see Caesar's role becomes more concrete as he builds his philosophies, his moral standards, and establishing the grounds of this ape-like community leads him to discover so much more once you're getting further into the film, into acts of kindness and the war that settles in within the apes causing it, and how that all builds up, leading Caesar to realize so many revelations, becomes just so good by the nature of everything that is getting established and building up from this franchise as a whole. Leading in to number 1, we got War for the Planet of the Apes, one that is good and aesthetically pleasing by the cinematography, by all the different environments that we are brought into. It is a beautiful film by the settings, going into the desert, going into the jungle, or going into the snow, and everything that establishes throughout, going into these different aesthetics that are familiar to the original franchise, or what we got from the older films in the 70s, and just immersing that into this, caging up the apes in their own slavery, and how you get all these uprisings of the apes, while also Caesar getting more concrete, Andy Serkis bringing off one of his best performances, especially as he's given more dialogue, giving more to do within the action of the film, becomes so compelling by the nature that this film pulls off, and how you bring up this uprising of the war, the apes versus the humans, and how that all establishes while they're trying to connect with the humans. While Caesar has a good heart toward humans, there's something to be said about the nature of the philosophies and the humans, and everything that the thematic elements pull off with this film makes it a great action film, a great sci-fi film, and just so wondrous for the nature of everything that this film manages to pull off, by the wonder and spectacle that it has as a war film as well, making it my number 1 Planet Apes films that I love. So let me know down in the comments below how you would rank the Planet Apes films from your least favorite to your favorite, whether it's all 10 or you just read the most recent quadrilogy. Let me know all of that. Make sure to like this video if you enjoy it, subscribe if you're already, to join in the film culture community as we talk about the love of cinema as a whole. So thank you for watching. Be sure to do yourself a favor and go watch a movie.